I think we're live. We are. What is up, my friend? Happy Friday. It's Mikey Henninger from Basement Brewed Fantasy Football, and welcome into episode 39 of Inside the 20 by Basement Brewed Fantasy Football. We're doing it live like we do every single Friday at noon Central right here on the YouTube channel, or I found out we're also on Twitch and Facebook and Patreon. We're kind of all over the place at this point, which is pretty sweet. But today we are going to be talking Week 4 fantasy football. And in all likelihood, the majority of today's shows are going to be about start-sit questions, or maybe there's some, how would you rank this player moving forward, or who should I trade for, who should I trade away? But let's talk about Week 4 fantasy football. Bring your questions, bring your dilemmas, your start-sit decisions that you need to make, and let's work through them together right here, right now. Episode 39, I think, of Inside the 20 by Basement Brewed Fantasy Football. All right, y'all, let's get into it. Happy Friday. I know it's the greatest day of the week for many of you. The Week 4 heat map is live. It's ready to go for anybody who has start-sit decisions, start-sit dilemmas that they're trying to work through here in Week 4. I am going to start out with a question that I received recently in my Fantasy Football Discord server, which is an online army. It's an online community. We got about 197 and counting other fantasy football players in that Discord server. Basically just sharing insights, swapping strategy, sharing news, and helping each other out, helping each other dominate. And one of them had a pretty good question, and I'm going to pull that up here in a minute. While I'm doing that, feel free to start flooding the comment section with all of your questions so we can start getting into what to expect in Week 4 fantasy football. So I'm going to pop up my screen here, which always takes me just a minute to figure out because there's like a ton of buttons to click for some reason. Pop that open. Add it to the stage. There we go. All right, y'all. I think that is what you're looking for here. Tanner's gonna hurt me because I know I don't think that's quite the screen that he wants me to be using, but no, that's not it either. That's definitely not it. That looks like it. All right, Russ wants to know Jaden Daniels, Kyler Murray. All right, we got some questions flooding in here that we'll get to definitely in 1 minute, but I wanted to start with one quick question, like I mentioned. So I'm popping up my Fantasy Football Discord server, and recently, I have to recall what channel it is in. Somebody basically asked me, here we go. This is what I'm looking for. So Big Mamu, which is, I don't know, that's just a funny screen name to me. Big Mamu wanted to know, for future reference, when I'm trying to decide between two different players, and in this case, he's referencing my heat map, which I'm sure we'll talk about plenty in today's conversation. But he was basically trying to decide between two players. And when he's making that decision between two players who he wants in his lineup and who he's going to leave on his bench, he wanted to know if I prioritize the matchup, like the matchup that player has, or if other factors such as their implied total, the spread, the over-under, things of that nature, which one should I prioritize when making that decision? So I thought it would be good to walk you guys through a little bit, let you in on my brain and how my brain works when I'm making a lot of these start-sit decisions. Now, keep in mind that every single league, all of your leagues are completely different. Scoring settings are different. Roster sizes, all of that stuff matters when making these decisions. But just generally speaking, when I'm stuck on two different players and I'm trying to decide who is going to be in and who is going to be out, the matchup matters, but the matchup is more the gravy on top of the overall decision. Ultimately, what we're trying to find in fantasy football is volume. volume is what wins fantasy football games. Now, the best way to find volume is to look at, if you're trying to do it from an objective standpoint and not go with your gut, if you're trying to use numbers to find volume, the best way to do that is looking at Vegas lines and sportsbooks lines for the games. And you can look at their over under, you can look at the spread, you can look at the implied point total for each team. And all of those things matter when it comes to trying to identify volume in the upcoming fantasy football game. Now, matchups, like I said, they're still relevant. They're still helpful. They're gravy on top, but they're more helpful with identifying efficiency, right? If you find a good matchup, you can bet that that player has a good chance of winning, gaining more yards, scoring touchdowns, etc. So I like to combine both of those things, which is exactly what I do in my heat map every single week. But ultimately, when I'm trying to make this decision, I'm looking first and foremost for volume. I want to target, if I'm looking for quarterbacks, I'm looking for quarterbacks that have a high implied total. I'm looking for quarterbacks that have a high implied total, but they might be in a shootout with, like, their opponent might be scoring. They might be going back and forth. I'm looking for and then I'm looking for quarterbacks in a good matchup. So, for example, in week 4, the premier game of the week, like if I had to build a fantasy football roster around one team or one game, this would be the game. Commanders at Cardinals. This one has an over under of 50.5. That's easily the highest on the week 4 slate. Both teams have top 8, I believe, if I recall correctly. Both teams have top 8 implied point totals. Neither team is expected to score less than 23 points. This game has shootout written all over it. So if I can get exposure to the Commanders versus Cardinals game, I want to get that game into my fantasy football lineup. Okay. On the other hand, a game like this one, the Titans and Dolphins, this one, just generally speaking, is ugly. It has an over under of 36.5, very, very low. That's the lowest on the slate. Neither team is expected to score even just 20 points, suggesting there won't be a lot of touchdowns. And when there's not a lot of touchdowns, there's usually not a lot of fantasy points. So this is generally speaking, this is a game that I would mostly avoid more often than not. So ultimately, and we'll talk a lot more about this as we go through some of these specific decisions that we're going to go through, but ultimately what I'm looking for is projectable volume. I want quarterbacks that are going to throw a lot of passes. And quarterbacks that are going to score touchdowns. That's the more important thing. I want running backs that aren't going to get scripted out of the game. I want running backs that are going to get plenty of rushing volume or perhaps plenty of targets if they do fall behind. I want wide receivers and I want tight ends that are going to get plenty of targets. And we can somewhat predict those games and those outcomes when we're looking at Vegas lines such as over, under, spreads, and implied totals. And in the week 4 heat map, and in every heat map that I do, those numbers are readily accessible every single week for every single game. And I update this stuff every day. Okay. Now, as for the matchups, that's where you want to double click on every player's name or any player's name and read what to expect from that player in their matchup. So we'll get into some of these things with some of these decisions moving forward, but hopefully that gives you a glimpse into the mind. It gives you an idea of what it is that I'm looking at, the checklist, if you will, that I'm going through when I'm making some of these start-sit decisions. And again, we'll dive deeper into all of these moving forward with quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, etc. All right, so let's start getting into some of these questions that are popping into the comments. But first, of course, a really quick word from our sponsor. Are you a software wizard? A code ninja? A forge master? Or maybe even just a mad scientist? Then come build your career ladder with Infinity Labs, an award-winning technology company, best place to work, and business of the year with best-in-class benefits and compensation. Visit i-labs.tech. That's i-labs.tech today, where you can learn more about Infinity Labs, our expanding national presence, and why the status quo has no hold on us. All right, y'all. Big thanks to Infinity Labs. Big thanks to Jason Molnar at Infinity Labs, who it looks like he was the general manager of the week in his company fantasy football league. He's a Basement Brood fantasy football subscriber. I can't imagine why he would have such a good week. But actually, it's weird that week 3 was his best week, because week 3 was the worst week for Basement Brood fantasy football. It was brutal. We're moving on. We're looking at week 4 moving forward. Really quickly, I know I just said we'll get into these start sits, and we will, but I did forget that I wanted to highlight the games of the week, the games that I'm targeting in week 4 fantasy football. We talked about the Commanders and the Cardinals. That's a top game. The other games that I am just generally trying to get into my fantasy football lineups this week are the Bills and the Ravens. Healthy over under at 46.5 points. Both teams have implied totals in the top half of football. Neither team is expected to score less than 22 points. That game has shootout written all over it. Seahawks Lions, same thing, 46.5. Healthy implied totals. Neither team is expected to win by a lot, lose by a lot. Should be a close game that features plenty of touchdowns. Again, this is one of the games that I want to get into my week 4 fantasy football lineup as frequently as I can. Games to avoid, Titans and Dolphins. I don't want much of, there's very few players from that game that I would want any sort of exposure to. The Chargers being 7 point, oops, that ain't right. There we go. I was going to say, there's no way the Chargers are 7 point favorites over the Chiefs. The Chargers being 7 point underdogs against the Chiefs, I want no part of their running game, which is basically all they have to offer. Browns Raiders looks like an ugly game. Neither team is projected to score 20 points. There's very few that I want exposure to in that game. And then the New England Patriots, just in general, especially the running game. This is the sort of game where the Patriots are 10.5 point favorites to score 10.5 point underdogs, to score underdogs. Generally speaking, that implies a supremely negative game script that will eventually force them to abandon the run. And that is bad news for Ramondre Stevenson or any Patriots ball carriers. All right, let's hop into this thing. Russ says, heat map rocks. I appreciate you, Russ. Thank you so much for saying that. And speaking of Russ has the first question of the day. Oh my gosh. And that is all we have time for today. I'm logging off. Man, that is already a really, really impossible one. Jaden Daniels or Kyler Murray? The answer right here is going to be Kyler Murray. And here's why. So I already mentioned this twice. I want this game in general, right? Commanders, Cardinals, 50.5 point over under. There should be no shortage of touchdowns for either side in this game. Now, Kyler Murray's Cardinals have an implied point total of about 27 points. Again, there should be no shortage of touchdowns. And usually where there's touchdowns, there's yards. And where there's yards, there's fantasy points. There should be no shortage of fantasy points in this game. Now, their implied point total of 27 points, that's actually the highest on the week. That's highest on the week 4 slate. There's literally no other team among 32 teams that are expected to score more points than the Commanders in week 4. Now, I have Kyler Murray in my blue column, column A, which is very hard to make it into. Basically, column A is saying he checks every single possible box. The data suggests that Kyler Murray could and should have an explosion week. There's literally nothing that's working against him in week 4. Now, you can always double click on any player's name to get their full write-up and their full analysis. So we'll kind of go through this together here real quick. Now, the bottom line, the TLDR for Kyler Murray, he's an exciting QB1, big time upside. This should be a shootout, and it's a gorgeous, gorgeous matchup. We talked a little bit about the over-under. We talked about the implied point total, but here's also what we talked about how that helps with knowing where touchdowns are going to come from. And we talked a little bit about how matchups help identify efficiency. It's the gravy on top, right? So after 3 games, the Washington Commanders are getting absolutely dismantled by opposing quarterbacks. They're hemorrhaging the 3rd most passing yards. They're hemorrhaging the most passing touchdowns. These guys are giving up 3 passing touchdowns every single game. I know it's only been 3, but 9 passing touchdowns in 3 games is easily the most in the NFL so far. As you would imagine, they're allowing the most fantasy points. They're giving up 24.4 fantasy points per game. And by the way, this is not a new trend by any means. Last year's Commanders allowed the most fantasy points per game. So it's not like, yes, we do have a small sample size for 2024 where it's only 3 games, but this has been going on since last year. They've been bad against quarterbacks for the last 20 games now. Baker Mayfield, Daniel Jones, and Joe Burrow all scored 18 or more fantasy points against the Commanders this year, including 29.6 from Baker Mayfield in week 1 and 25.4 from Joe Burrow just last week. Now, Kyler Murray, we know that he had 2 mediocre games and he had 1 explosion, right? He's averaging about 212 passing yards. He's got 5 passing touchdowns, 1 interception, 54 scoreless rushing yards. He's getting you about 19.8, about 20 fantasy points per game. Pretty strong. He scored a dominant 28.5 fantasy points in week 2, but then just short of 15 points in week 3, and he had 16 points in week 1. He is a great quarterback to begin with, but when you look at his matchup, you look at the over-under, you look at his implied total, Kyler Murray very well may be the number 1 quarterback on the entire week 4 slate. I'd have a really tough time having him on the bench. Now, Jaden Daniels is an absolute monster, right? Let's go down to game 11. We're looking at game 11, Jaden Daniels versus Kyler Murray. Now, again, double click on the name. He also is a QB1 with shootout enhanced upside. He's already been balling. He had 2 different elite performances of more than 28 fantasy points in 2 of 3 weeks already. The Cardinals aren't a bad matchup for quarterbacks either. They're allowing the 15th most passing yards, 13th most passing touchdowns, 2nd most rushing touchdowns, and the 8th most fantasy points per game at just shy of 19 fantasy points per game. Now, the trick there with the Cardinals is that 59% of that damage against the Cardinals came at the hands of one man, Josh Allen. Josh Allen scored 33.2 fantasy points against the Cardinals back in week 1. He had 232 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 39 rushing yards, and 2 rushing touchdowns. Since then, Jared Goff and who was the other? Matthew Stafford didn't do much against the Arizona Cardinals. So it's not nearly as delicious of a matchup for Jaden Daniels as it is for Kyler Murray. Forced to choose between the two, which, by the way, is a great problem to have. I'm going with Kyler Murray here. Hope that helps. Give me one. I wanted to start tracking these so I can kind of keep track of how things are going, but we'll do that next show. All right, next up. We'll come back to you, Russ, because I want to hop into the next one. Jordan Poggle he says, sorry in advance. I don't even want to read the rest of this already. Top 3 wide receivers are hurt. It's just that kind of year, man. It's insane. Cooper Kupp, I have one league where I have Cooper Kupp, Deebo Samuel, and AJ Brown on the same roster. And I'm like, what? I'm just trying to find a living, breathing body at this point. Do I roll with Rashid Shaheed and Mike Williams this week? Or do I pick up somebody from a pool of Jordan Addison, Andre Iosivas? I never feel confident in how I say that. Dontavian Wicks, Michael Wilson, Jahan Dotson, Tutu Atwell, or DeAndre Hopkins. So this is why you're saying sorry in advance, because there's way too many options here. And I'll try my best to keep this quick. Now, first and foremost, Jordan Addison should not be available on waiver wires. Sam Darnold is exceeding expectations. The Vikings look terrific. Jordan Addison is going to have some very big fantasy football games. Like, if you have to close this window and shut down this show to go add Jordan Addison, do that. He needs to be picked up immediately. He should not be a free agent. DeAndre Hopkins had a great week 3, and he still hasn't even played 50% of the offensive snaps yet. He should not be on waiver wires. Now, that being said, if we're talking specifically in week 4, Jordan Addison and DeAndre Hopkins are both very risky fantasy football assets specific to week 4, because they're both, like DeAndre Hopkins, like I said, he still hasn't played 50% on the snaps yet. There's no guarantee that will be the case this week. We already talked about how gross the Titans-Vikings game is. If DeAndre Hopkins plays, will he dance with Jalen Ramsey a little bit? Although that could be Calvin Ridley's problem. There's not a lot of reason to get excited about DeAndre Hopkins in week 4 specifically, but moving forward, he had a great game in week 3, still hasn't played 50% of the snaps. He's going to get more and more involved as the season goes on. And then the same thing for Jordan Addison. He theoretically could benefit if the Packers choose to shadow Justin Jefferson with Jair Alexander. Jordan Addison would then theoretically free up for a lot of looks. They still don't have TJ Hawkinson. He's the clear-cut number 2 wide receiver. But again, he's coming off injury. There's no guarantee that he's going to play a full complement of snaps. And if he does, we don't know how effective he'll be. We don't know if they'll limit him. We just don't know what to expect. So there's some risk involved to both of those guys. Now, there is plenty of upside to Jordan Addison as a week 4 option, especially when you compare him to Rashid Shaheed, Mike Williams. To me, Mike Williams is not an option this week. I don't want to drop Mike Williams because he is working his way into full-time status, just like DeAndre Hopkins is. But he still hasn't played. I think his most so far is 24% of the offensive snaps. We're not there yet with Mike Williams, so he's not an option in week 4, but I wouldn't drop him if you don't have to. Now, let me remind myself about Rashid Shaheed's outlook. Okay, so looking at Saints-Falcons, that's game number 4. Okay, so heading over towards game number 4, found Rashid Shaheed right here in the yellow column, which is the C column, the meh. column. The meh column, the yellow column, tells us there's just not a lot of data, good or bad, to expect a player to have an explosion week or have a particularly bad week. It's just a meh kind of week. Just kind of expect what you normally expect from that player. So Rashid Shaheed is a boom or bust wide receiver 4 or flex. Now, at the individual level, as far as the matchup goes, wide receivers have done pretty well against the Falcons so far. George Pickens scored over 13 points against them in week 1. Devontae Smith went over 20 in week 2. Rashee Rice went over 29 in week 3. Now, that's noteworthy, and this is why the heat map comes into play for so many people, is because a lot of times you'll look over here underneath the wide receiver column, and you'll see that, all right, the Falcons are 19 underneath wide receivers, meaning they're holding wide receivers to the 14th fewest fantasy points per game. 32 minus 19 is 14. Okay. So they're allowing the 19th most PPR points per game to wide receivers. That's not great. That's not necessarily a matchup that you get excited about. They're doing pretty well at the team level against wide receivers. They're allowing the 9th most catches, the 15th most touchdowns, but they're also holding them to the 9th fewest yards and 14th fewest PPR points. And that's a lot. That has a lot to do with AJ Terrell and his shadow coverage, which in this case would go against Chris Olave, which would give Rashid Shaheed theoretically a better matchup in that offense. But like I said, as good as they've been at the team level, they are giving up production at the individual level. And that tells us we should not be as scared of the matchup as it looks when you see it at first glance. Now, in week 8 against the Falcons last year, when Rashid Shaheed was playing full-time snaps in that offense, he caught 3 of 4 targets for 65 yards, 1 touchdown, which is the key here for Rashid Shaheed, which was over 15 PPR points. Now, the trick with Rashid Shaheed is his targets. He's averaging just 4.7 targets per game after 3 contests, and that's not likely to go up anytime soon. That's just the type of player, that's the type of asset that Rashid Shaheed is. Now, he's fun to watch. He's one of my favorite players to watch in that Saints offense, but averaging fewer than 5 targets per game automatically is going to make a player boom or bust, meaning Rashid Shaheed is going to basically need to score a touchdown to pay off, because we can bet he's not going to get 8, 9, 10 targets. So automatically he's boom or bust. He's a little bit risky. And if you want more details, Jordan, I know you're a heat map subscriber, so you can get all the details here, but boom or bust, I'm not feeling particularly optimistic or pessimistic about Rashid Shaheed. We just basically have to close our eyes and pray that he scores a touchdown. And when you're thinking about needing a touchdown from Rashid Shaheed, that's when it makes sense to go back and look at the game totals, right? 42.5 point over under. That's not great, but it's not terrible. It's right in the middle of the pack. It's right in the middle of all 16 games. The Saints are projected to score less than 21 points, so fewer than 3 touchdowns theoretically. So theoretically, we're not loving Rashid Shaheed's chances of scoring a touchdown. Mike Williams, not an option. Jordan Addison, definitely an option. Okay. So we talked a little bit about him, but let's actually dive into it a little bit. He's a wide receiver 3 play. Now, AJ Brown, Devontae Smith, Alec Pierce, and DeAndre Hopkins, all 4 of those guys scored 15 plus PPR points against the Packers, and they've only played 3 games. So in 3 games, 4 different wide receivers have gotten you 15 against the Packers. And again, like I mentioned, if Jair Alexander shadows Justin Jefferson, that would theoretically open up a better matchup for Jordan Addison. The Vikings have an implied total of about 20.5 points. I think this game has a little bit of sneaky shootout potential, but again, I'm not trying to make this about my gut or my personal feelings. That's just the Vegas is telling us they have an implied total of about 20.5 points. The Packers at the team level, they're middle of the pack. Get it? Packers, middle of the pack. Yeah. Against wide receivers, they're holding wide receivers with the 16th fewest catches. They're allowing the 15th most yards, the 15th most touchdown, and 16th most PPR points. So they're like smack dab in the middle of the NFL. Now, Jordan Addison played about 51% of the offensive snaps in week 1 before he went down with the injury that has caused him to miss the last 2 games. He was operating at a solid pace in that game. He only played about half the game, and he caught 3 of 4 targets for 35 scoreless yards, 6.5 PPR points. He was on pace for about 12. Obviously, that's a tiny sample size. We can't go off that and say, Jordan Addison's going to get us 13 PPR points per game. But he got off to a good start. His matchup looks good. The game looks good. Jordan Addison is actually a pretty solid option in week 4. Andre Iosivas. Oh, no. See, I'm already breaking my own. That's because my mic is sitting in my way here. All right. Andre Iosivas. How are we feeling about him? A lot to go through here. So I'm not going to go through all of it, right? We want to try and speed this up a little bit. Quality wide receiver 4 with shootout enhanced upside. Kind of wild to think that the Bengals versus Panthers has an over under a 47.5. The Panthers are in the upper half of implied total. Suddenly they're looking like they could create a shootout with the Cincinnati Bengals. Wild to think about. Now, the Bengals have a strong implied total, 26 points. That gives Iosivas a decent chance of scoring a touchdown. The Andy Dalton Bowl, right? The team that drafted Andy Dalton, he's coming back to Cincinnati, or it's in Carolina, but he's playing against Cincinnati. It's got a really strong over-under, 47.5, which is the second highest among all 16 games. Iosivas is doing well, but again, he's averaging just 5.7 targets per game, and that's a number that's going to continue to drop as T. Higgins gets more and more ramped up in that offense. He has 6 or more targets and 14 or more PPR points in 2 of 3 games, which is great. But again, that number is going to start going down. He did well in week 3 with T. Higgins. The Panthers are doing, they're about middle of the pack against wide receivers. They're holding them to the 13th. They're allowing the 13th most PPR points per game. Chris Olave and Devontae Adams both came up short of 9 PPR points against the Panthers, but during those games, while Chris Olave and Devontae Adams were doing nothing, Rashid Shaheed, Quentin Johnson, Jacoby Myers, and Trey Tucker all tagged the Carolina Panthers for 16 or more PPR points, including 22 plus for both Quentin Johnson and Trey Tucker. So if that tells us anything, it's that maybe the Carolina Panthers have done well with shutting down wide receiver ones, while one of the ancillary options, like a T. Higgins, like a Andre Iosivas, while they kind of go off in those games. Last year's Panthers held opposing wide receivers to the second fewest PPR points per game. Take that with a grain of salt. That's last year. This stuff changes year to year, but it's at least good to know that they were a top 2 in the team in the NFL when it came to shutting down wide receivers last year. So Iosivas, solid option. Rashid Shaheed, solid option. Jordan Addison, solid option. Dontavian Wicks, I really like the player, but as long as Romeo Doubs, Christian Watson, and Jaden Reed are healthy, Dontavian Wicks is nothing more than a touchdown or bust. I wouldn't even call him a flex option because he's just not on the field as much as he needs to be a realistic fantasy football option. Michael Wilson, I absolutely love this week. As much as you can love Michael Wilson. Again, we talked about the Cardinals-Commanders game being a shootout. We talked about the Cardinals scoring a lot of points. We talked about the Commanders being the best possible matchup for a quarterback, and it's the exact same with wide receivers. So with Michael Wilson, let me pop this up here real quick. With Michael Wilson, especially, by the way, Trey McBride is not going to be playing he's already been announced as out. I'm actually going to be moving Michael Wilson into column C with a green dot. So I'm really, really excited about Michael Wilson this week, especially without Trey McBride. That frees up 6, 7, 8, 9 targets in that offense in a shootout. We talked about the over-under. We talked about the implied total. The Commanders are getting absolutely smashed by wide receivers. 5th most catches, 3rd most yards, most touchdowns. These guys are giving up 3 touchdowns per game to wide receivers. There's over 52 PPR points to be had every week for wide receivers going up against the Commanders. And again, that is not a new trend. Last year's Commanders allowed the 2nd most PPR points per game. This has been going on for about 20 games. Commanders cannot stop quarterbacks, and they cannot stop wide receivers. 5 different wide receivers, Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, Malik Neighbors, Jamar Chase, and Andre Iosivas, have already scored 16 or more PPR points against the Commanders this year. 3 games and 5 wide receivers have gotten you 15 or more PPR points. That's almost 2 every single game. So Marvin Harrison, Michael Wilson, right? Theoretically. Oh, and by the way, 4 of those guys that scored 15 points scored more than 22 points. So 4 different wide receivers in 3 games have scored 22 or more PPR points against the Washington Commanders. Now, Michael Wilson, he started the week with 2 duds, right? He had just 4 targets and 3 catches in 2 games combined in weeks 1 and 2. We should not ignore that. Like, the guy literally wasn't involved in the team's offense, but he did come on a bit in week 3. He caught 8 of 9 targets for 64 scoreless yards, 14 plus PPR points. This is a good spot, especially with Trey McBride missing this game and freeing up 7 targets. This is a great spot for Michael Wilson to leave a mark. If you're in anybody who's listening, not just Jordan, if you're in a week 4 pinch and you need a wide receiver here now this week specifically, Michael Wilson is a great roll of the dice. Jahan Dotson is intriguing if Devontae Smith and AJ Brown don't play. If that happens, then Jahan Dotson is a wide receiver 4 flex with some upside just based on opportunity and target potential alone. If AJ Brown plays or if Devontae Smith plays, he's not even an option. Tutu Atwell looked great for the Rams last week. Let me remind myself what we're looking at with Tutu Atwell, and I'll just keep this one quick. Oh yeah, Rams-Bears. Looks like it'll be a low-scoring game. Rams don't even have a projected implied total of, they're not even expected to score 19. Tough matchup against the Bears, who are holding wide receivers to the 6th fewest PPR points. I would eliminate him from the conversation. To me, it looks like you're going with 2 here, Jordan. I would be adding Jordan Addison for sure. And if that means you have to drop one of those other guys, I would be okay with adding Addison and dropping. I don't want to drop Mike Williams, but Shaheed is actually producing. So I would go with Jordan Addison. And honestly, if this is PPR, I would honestly roll the dice on Michael Wilson because none of these other options are like sure things. And here's another thing about me, guys, is if I'm in a spot where it's like, I don't have an obvious option, I don't have a sure thing, like all of these guys are dice rolls. There's none of these that you can throw in the lineup and be like, this dude's going to smash. And when I'm in that situation, I want to aim for maximum upside. And if you're taking Michael Wilson, who will be without Trey McBride in the shootout of the week against the worst defense in football against wide receivers, I'm aiming for that maximum upside, understanding that it could go really wrong, but it also could go really, really right. And if all of these guys are dice rolls, I'm swinging for the fences. So for me, I'm going to go with Jordan Addison and Michael Wilson here, which feels wild, but that's my answer. All right. Jose wants to know, who should I bench and start 2 running backs and 1 flex? So 2 running backs, 1 flex. So 3. So basically you need 3 players out of here, if I'm understanding that right. And it's Ramondre Stevenson. The answer here, if you're looking for just one of these to bench, it's Ramondre Stevenson. I love Ramondre Stevenson as a player. And this goes back to what I was talking about at the very beginning of this episode. The New England Patriots are 10.5-point road underdogs, suggesting these guys are going to get blown out. It's not even going to be close. The 49ers should run all over them. The Patriots are projected to score just 15 points. So they're not expected to score a lot of touchdowns. The 49ers defense could possibly score some touchdowns here. So what you're looking at here with a spread like this, and this is a big red flag. This is one of those scenarios where, okay, Ramondre Stevenson on the surface has a good matchup, right? The 49ers are allowing the 8th most PPR points per game to running backs. That's great, but it won't matter if Ramondre Stevenson is not going to get the ball. And as last week, the Patriots got somewhat blown out by the New York Jets, and Ramondre Stevenson didn't even have 10 touches. He got just scripted out. He got left out of the game basically entirely. Now, you could always make the case that he'll rack up catches, but the Patriots also have Antonio Gibson, who's literally a former wide receiver. And when he came to New England, he was widely expected to be their primary pass catching back. So you got Ramondre Stevenson, who theoretically would need to butter his bread on rushing yards and touchdowns. The Patriots aren't expected to score a lot of touchdowns to begin with. And you can't get rushing yards when your team is losing by 10.5 points and they abandon the run because they have to throw the ball all over the place. I love Ramondre Stevenson. I do not love Ramondre Stevenson this week. I have him in column C just because he does get good volume when the Patriots are competitive. But this is a game where the Patriots most likely will not be competitive. They have an impossibly low implied total that we've already talked about. That I want, if I have an opportunity to bench Ramondre Stevenson, I'm taking that opportunity. And you have 3 great options. David Montgomery, I have him right here in column B with a green dot. He's a strong, solid, quality RB2. Feel good about him, especially in a shootout, high-scoring game with the Seahawks. He's always a good bet to score a touchdown on a team that uses him in the red zone and has an implied point total of 25 points. Feel great about David Montgomery. Josh Jacobs, I feel less great about than David Montgomery. I have him in column B still. Twice, apparently. This is supposed to be Jaden Reed, baby? I'm going to have to fix that. Let me highlight that so I don't forget. Okay. Josh Jacobs, I feel less great about than David Montgomery, but I still feel a heck of a lot better about Josh Jacobs than I feel about Ramondre Stevenson. The Packers are favored by 3 points. He should be plenty involved. There's no Marshawn Lloyd. He's the clear RB1. Volume should not be a question for Josh Jacobs. He should get plenty of it to be relevant, where Ramondre Stevenson is a legitimate risk to be left behind in that game early. Like, the Patriots could be abandon the run by halftime. Terry McLaurin, we saw Terry McLaurin come on at the end of last game. He still only had 4 catches. We want to see Terry McLaurin get more than 4 catches. However, again, he's in the shootout. This is the game that we want to target in week 4 fantasy football. Commanders have a strong implied total. They're underdogs, so theoretically they will need to throw the ball to try and keep up with the Cardinals. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about a Commanders team that barely threw the ball in week 1 when they lost by 17. So while that's true for most teams, that's not necessarily true for the Commanders, but still, we're talking about a shootout here. Game 11. Let me find Terry McLaurin real quick. Game 11. Here he is. Just looking at the matchup really quickly. 3 games. The Cardinals are middle of the pack against wide receivers. They're allowing the 14th most catches, 16th most yards, 15th most touchdowns, and all while still... Oh, yeah, I forgot about this. So they're allowing above average numbers. 14th most catches, 16th most yards, 15th most touchdowns, and all the while they're actually holding wide receivers to the 15th fewest PPR points per game. Doesn't really matter, but it's just something to know. It's interesting. And just so you know, last year's Cardinals, this is a similar trend to last year. They allowed the 16th most PPR points per game. So the point is, there's nothing that's great about the matchup, but there's nothing terrifying about it either. I would fire him up in a shootout with the Cardinals. To me, Ramondre Stevenson is the odd man out, and it's actually not even close. So I'd feel really good about that decision to leave Ramondre Stevenson out in this one, use him in future weeks. Mr. Gabe Garcia wants to know, with Trey McBride out, who are good tight end targets on waivers? I'm glad you asked, my friend. I don't know how well you can see this. Let me pump it up. Every week on the heat map, which, again, this is what we've been looking at, right? This is the tool. By the way, anybody who's listening, if you're not familiar with the heat map, this is the resource that launched my entire company. This thing went viral on Reddit a couple of years back. It provides contextual matchup analysis for every single player, every single game, every single week to help you identify questions just like this one. With Trey McBride out, who are good tight end targets on waivers? And just a reminder, Russ says the heat map rocks. And Russ is right. The heat map does rock. All right. So part of the heat map is the streamers and stashes tab. So if you're in a pinch, like it sounds like you are this week, Gabe, Trey McBride if you're in a pinch and you need to find a defense, I got you. I got a little cheat sheet, a little list of defenses to target. If you need a kicker, I got you. Here's a list. I'm currently working on a research project that helps identify kickers that could perform in the upcoming week. Stay tuned. That one's not ready for public production yet. If you need quarterbacks, I got you. If you want to stash some running backs in case the guy in front of them gets hurt, I got you. But tight ends is what you're looking for here. And in my streamers cheat sheet, I have a list top to bottom of I got wide receivers on the brain today. Tight ends that you can target in your fantasy football leagues. So first and foremost, always I don't know what platform you're on. Some platforms have Taysom Hill as a quarterback. Some have him as a tight end. If he's available as a tight end, he should be rostered because he's basically a backup running back that's listed as a tight end. Anytime you get a tight end that's getting multiple carries per game, especially in the red zone, that could pay off, especially if you're in a pinch and you need a tight end. Now, keep in mind, he's the ultimate dice roll. Like, you could get a 0 out of Taysom Hill, but you could also get 20 plus points out of Taysom. So always check to see if he's available. Cole Kmet came on really, really strong last week. Now, he did almost nothing in weeks 1 and 2, but he had, I think, if memory serves, he had 11 targets last week. He had at least 9, 10, 11, somewhere around there. He had a lot. So he's on the list. And again, if you ever want to know why for any of these players, you can always just come back here and double click on literally anybody's name. It's going to have all the analysis you could possibly want for that player. Cole Kmet, feel free to grab a screenshot of this, Gabriel. Cole Kmet, Brenton Strange is a quality streamer, but only if Evan Ingram sits. If Evan Ingram plays, Brenton Strange is completely useless in fantasy football. Dalton Schultz is a touchdown or bust option. Pat Freiermuth, Zach Ertz, Colby Parkinson, Noah Fant, Hunter Henry. There's a whole list here. Definitely feel free to take a screenshot, or selfish plug here, feel free to scoop up the week 4 heat map. If anybody out there has commitment issues and they don't want to buy the entire season of heat maps, if you don't want to subscribe to a monthly tier, you can get the week 4 heat map for just $4.99. All I'm asking is you buy me a beer. It's Friday night. I want to drink a beer. $4.99. There should be a link in the show notes or in the description that takes you to that. If not, let me know in the comments, because I actually have no idea if there's a link, but there should be a link. In fact, I think, let me do this real quick. Patreon. Okay. All of my stuff goes through Patreon, and I am dropping in the below the link to basically all of my plans if you are interested at any point. If not, go with the week 4 heat map for just $4.99. That's in the shop. You'll want to click on shop. Otherwise, you can get the whole season of heat maps in the shop. Otherwise, there are monthly subscription options that would also give you access to our Discord server. So check all that out if you so choose. All right, what's next here? Parker Bledsoe. Parker, any relation to my guy Drew Bledsoe? That'd be cool. Parker Bledsoe wants to know, should I take this trade? CMC, oh boy, and Zay Flowers for Gibbs. 0-3, need to win soon. I also have Jordan Mason. You can't take that trade. Oh, wait. Are you saying you would trade away Christian McCaffrey? If you need to win, then you need Jahmyr Gibbs. But trading away Zay Flowers, I'm assuming you're saying that you're thinking of trading Christian McCaffrey plus Zay Flowers for Jahmyr Gibbs. If that's the case, I am more than fine with that trade, which is wild, right? Who would have thought we'd be bundling Christian McCaffrey with something to get to Jahmyr Gibbs? But the truth is, we don't know where we're going with Christian McCaffrey. Now, I follow Dr. Deepak Chona on Twitter, as well as Dr. Jesse Morsey. Both of those guys are recommended follows on Twitter. Both guys, if you're not familiar, they're both legitimate medical doctors. Like, that's what they do in their day job, but they're also fantasy football players, and they have databases of player injuries and how long to expect them being out and how effective they'll be when they come back. And I believe it was Dr. Chona, not Dr. Morsey, but I believe it was Dr. Chona earlier this week talking about the 49ers. Basically, he thinks the 49ers will manage Christian McCaffrey's workload all the way up until the playoffs, meaning, like, we don't know when he's going to play, and even when he does, he's certainly not going to be the Christian McCaffrey that we know and love and saw all of last year. So knowing the name, knowing the glitz and glamour of the name Christian McCaffrey, it's really hard to trade that away. But if we're looking at data and we're looking at numbers and we're looking at probability, which is what fantasy football is about, it's not looking good for Christian McCaffrey. It is looking good for Jahmyr Gibbs. And frankly, it is looking good. It's looking good for Zay Flowers as well. He's doing better this year than I was expecting him to do. But man, if you need somebody this week, and we're talking specifically at running back, Jahmyr Gibbs would be a great person to have on your roster. I don't know how the rest of your roster looks at wide receiver, if you can absorb the hit of losing Zay Flowers. But I mean, it's a tough call. This is the sort of thing that I would always recommend, by the way, sliding into our fantasy football Discord server. We literally have a entire channel dedicated to trades where you can slide in here, ask this very question, and get the advice of where are we at now? 197 other fantasy football players that are helping each other dominate and figure out stuff just like this. I don't know, Parker, man. I'd be very much on the fence about this one. And I think a lot of it depends on the remainder of your roster and the construction of your roster, what you have at wide receiver, what you have at running back. But in a vacuum, if I'm looking just at the trade, it honestly is fine. I wouldn't fault anybody for taking this trade to get to Jahmyr Gibbs, just knowing that, you are sacrificing a good wide receiver and the upside and the glitz and glamour of what Christian McCaffrey could mean. Although from a probability standpoint, it doesn't look great. Big Mac. Oh, now I'm hungry. Big Mac wants to know, 10-man. Is Dak, Saquon Barkley, Jonathan Taylor, Amon-Ra, Goddard Bowers, Amari Cooper, Jalen Waddle, Bucky Irving, Braylon Allen, Sutton, Zamir White, Chubb, Brian Thomas looking to trade Goddard and Allen for a wide receiver? Who should I? Okay, hang on. I need to read this again. Okay, so this is your team. Dak Prescott, great. Saquon, great. Jonathan Taylor, great. Amon-Ra, great. You have Goddard and Bowers, great. Definitely, this is a great week to try and sell Dallas Goedert after his week 3. Mari Cooper, solid. Waddle, not good. Although if they start Tyler Huntley, I did a ton of research on Tyler Huntley and what that means for wide receivers. All of that is actually in. I shouldn't have pumped this up so big. It's too big now. That's what. Never mind. I did a ton of research, by the way, on what to expect from wide receivers that are playing with Tyler Huntley. So if the Dolphins go with him, Jalen Waddle's not as scary with Huntley as he would be with Skylar Thompson. With Skylar Thompson, he's barely playable. So my point is, if you're thinking about trading Jalen Waddle, maybe just hang on for a minute. Bucky Irving, Braylon Allen, Cortland Sutton, Zamir White. Okay, so lots of depth here. You're looking to trade Dallas Goedert and Braylon Allen for a wide receiver. So Braylon Allen's actually getting enough work to be flex viable. He's getting enough work to be an RB3 or flex in fantasy football leagues, as is. Probably not in a 10-man, but in a 12-man for sure. He'd be on the radar. And obviously there's massive upside for Braylon Allen if anything did ever happen to Breece Hall. So he's definitely somebody worthy of stashing on your roster. So if you're going to package him, but here's the problem. If nothing happens to Breece Hall, then he's basically just a bench stash in a 10-man league. There's going to be very few scenarios where you actually put him in to your lineup. And knowing that, assuming your league mates know that, then they know that they'd be trading for a back end tight end 1 and a bench stash that could be good if things just kind of break right for him. As far as wide receivers to target, I don't know, man. That's a tough question because there's 200 wide receivers in the NFL. I will say, we were just talking about some of this earlier this week in the Discord server. We were talking about buy low candidates. So let me talk through some of these here real quick. Drake London is on the list as a buy low candidate. Well, Bijan Robinson's on the list, but that's not what we're looking for. Chris Olave is on the list. No, that's a sell high. I suspect fantasy managers may be growing impatient with CeeDee Lamb, though not anymore. T. Higgins might be a good one. T. Higgins might be somebody that their current manager's growing frustrated with. He didn't play until week 3, and then when he did very little. Garrett Wilson, I think, is a great buy low. There is going to be a day coming up not far from now that Garrett Wilson is going to absolutely crazy. He hasn't done it yet, and it's possible that the fantasy manager in your league is starting to give up on him. So those are guys that I would look at in general. Now, just being completely honest, I don't think there's a chance that the league manager in your league will trade a guy like Garrett Wilson for Dallas Goedert and a wide receiver and Braylon Allen. The other thing too is you're going to have to identify a manager whose tight end situation is bleak. Although for pretty much every fantasy manager nowadays, they're tight at like Travis Kelce's not working. Sam Laporta, Mark Andrews, Dalton Kincaid, none of these tight ends are working. So I guess everybody's tight end situation looks a little bit bleak. But for a guy like Dallas Goedert and a guy like Braylon Allen combined, you would have to look. I mean, Garrett Wilson would be my top target. I don't think they'll accept that. You would have to look like further down the list of wide receivers because I think Garrett Wilson is too heavy of a prize. You could try like Mike Evans, perhaps. We're waiting for him to do something. I don't know. Hopefully that helps. I always recommend that people take a look at my 2024 draft guide, players that were drafted high that just aren't performing but are still getting targets, and that those are typically pretty good buy low candidates. But start thinking guys like Mike Evans or that type of tier of wide receivers. Jay wants to know, do I trade DK for Higgins plus Waddle in a 12-team PPR? Man, DK is balling. And I think I love DK this week in particular. So I'd have a really tough time getting rid of him before kickoff on Sunday. He's in a shootout with the Lions. Delicious matchup. Seahawks are going to need to throw the ball. Lots of reason to like DK this week. So I wouldn't be rushing to trade him. I think ultimately DK and T Higgins are going to be relatively similar if both guys stay on the field, although DK is going to be more consistent, he's going to be better than T Higgins. The trick here is that you could potentially get Jalen Waddle for free, and like I was just talking about, Tyler Huntley at quarterback does provide optimism. He does here. Let me just pop it up here real quick. Jalen Waddle. Here we go. So in 10 career games, so we're hoping that the Dolphins move forward with Tyler Huntley and not Skylar Thompson. I think we saw as much as we needed to see from Skylar Thompson last week. So hopefully they go with Tyler Huntley. In 10 career games where Huntley threw the ball at least 17 times, he did not hesitate to pepper his top pass catchers with targets. So in those 10 games, 6 different pass catchers were hit with 10 or more targets in those 10 games. So 6 in 10 games. 7 if you count a running back, which was Justice Hill. Now, during those 10 games, 12 different pass catchers had 8 or more targets. Okay, so more than one wide receiver per game was getting 8 or more targets from Tyler Huntley. During those 10 games, 12 different pass catchers scored at least 10 PPR points, including 6 that scored 15 or more. Okay, so 6 out of 6 wide receivers in 10 games, or pass catchers, 6 pass catchers in 10 games scored 15 or more PPR points. The best Tyler Huntley pass catcher performance was Mark Andrews, who caught 10 of 13 targets for 136 yards and 2 touchdowns, 35 plus PPR points from Mark Andrews, RIP Mark Andrews, that week. Point is, now the quality of the targets of Tyler Huntley, that's a whole different conversation, but the volume should be there. Tyreek Hill should get chances. Jalen Waddle should get chances. Now, again, keep in mind, Jalen Waddle's the number 2. He's not the number 1. So if there's a guy who's going to get those targets, it's Tyreek Hill, not Jalen Waddle. Jalen Waddle will probably have some splash performances, but not in a way that's going to be predictable like it would be if it was Tua Tagovailoa. So he's not super excited. I think he's a decent buy low just in general, but I probably wouldn't trade DK to get both of those guys. Hopefully that helps. Although DK, I love DK this week, and maybe that's clouding my judgment because, I mean, his target share isn't absolutely terrific. He had a great week 2 in terms of targets, but he only had 4 targets in week 1. He's averaging 8 targets per game, but he had 14 targets in week 2. So I don't know. I'd stick with DK if it was me, but I wouldn't fault you for taking the trade. But if it's me personally, I would just stick with DK. Amit Kumar wants to know Mark Andrews or Isaiah Likely. Find your shiniest penny and flip it, my friend. I mean, look, man, at this point, there's something to be said about the probability that Mark Andrews gets what I think Evan Silva was the one who coined this term, the squeaky wheel treatment. Basically, that means the squeaky wheel is the one that's the loudest, the squeaky wheel, the guy that's not getting the work that he should be getting, meaning the Ravens at some point will be like, okay, we have to get Mark Andrews the football. Like, what is happening? What is going on? He didn't catch a single pass last week. Now, keep in mind, okay, he didn't catch a single pass last week. That's bad. There's no way that's a good thing. But the Ravens did only throw the ball 15 times, 15 pass attempts. They got the W pretty easily. They almost blew it, but they got the W pretty easily. We shouldn't necessarily panic about him not catching a pass last week. Although when you take that combined with the previous 2 weeks, I can start to understand the panic there. And it's the same thing with Isaiah Likely, right? It's like he only caught one pass last week. He only had one target. But again, they only threw 15 passes. Week 3 is more of an anomaly. I always think I say that wrong, than any other week. This one, it really is a coin toss. I mean, Isaiah Likely is the guy who's playing basically slot wide receiver for the Ravens. So he's always capable of what we saw in week 1. Mark Andrews is likely not going to be a 10, 11, 12 target kind of guy, but he's going to be the guy they look at in the red zone. So you look at this week in particular, right? It's Ravens, Bills. Good game, 46.5 point over under. Both teams have above average implied totals. There's some shootout potential there. The Bills are giving up the 8th most PPR points per game to tight ends. Although again, Isaiah Likely isn't necessarily he's more of a wide receiver than a tight end. It really is a coin flip, Amit. If it's me, I'm rolling the dice one more time on Mark Andrews here. If I have to choose one or the other. But I hate to say it, don't be surprised if it's Isaiah Likely. There's just no, when you look at the data, there's no way of knowing which one's going to hit. Now, I guess the one thing I will say is that the Bills are worse against tight ends than they are against wide receivers. And if we're looking at Isaiah Likely somewhat like a wide receiver, that would tip the scales in Mark Andrews' favor a little bit, although he's labeled as a tight end, and the Bills will probably play him like a tight end. So he's definitely a mismatch, right? There's not a corner that's big enough to run with Likely, and there's not a linebacker who's fast enough to run with Likely. So that's really not a great way to look at it. I'm just kind of throwing that out there in case that's something you want to think about. But if it's me, it really, really, really is a coin flip. And history is on Mark Andrews' side, even if recent history isn't. Jose wants to know, Joe Mixon practiced today. Should I still start Cam Akers or Zamir White? If Joe Mixon is playing, Cam Akers can't be an option. Dr. Deepak Chona does not expect Joe Mixon to play, but he does expect Dameon Pierce to play. And that whole situation's muddy because coming into the season, Dameon Pierce was the obvious number 2 running back. To me, I still need a lot more information on Cam Akers before I can consider starting him this week, because Joe Mixon could be active. Dameon Pierce could be active. Neither guy could be active. There's so many different possible outcomes for Cam Akers that I wouldn't feel comfortable making that decision until Sunday. If Sunday rolls around and both Dameon Pierce and Joe Mixon are out, then Cam Akers is an automatic RB2. I'd be starting him instantly. If Mixon is playing but limited, and if Mixon is playing and Dameon Pierce is playing, Akers is out. If Mixon is playing, well, Dameon Pierce is going to play. I don't think there's any reason to think he won't. So really, it's going to come down to whether or not Mixon plays. If Akers plays and Pierce does not play, oh my God. If Akers plays and Pierce plays, but Mixon doesn't play, God, that's hard to keep up with. Then Akers is a really risky RB3 or flex because theoretically Dameon Pierce will get the first crack. That said, Jose, is there anybody available on waivers that you can find? Because I would not be looking at Zamir White. I would not feel comfortable with Zamir White. Even in situations where Zamir White had a chance to smash, he didn't. And he's down here in column B. It's looking worse and worse and worse for Zamir White. I would recommend looking through, popping open your waivers. And I would recommend looking through column C here of the heat map, looking at running backs to see if there's anybody in this column that you can plug and play. Anybody who's in B is probably already rostered. But anybody who's in C, there's a chance that they're available in your waiver wire pool. For example, I've seen Chuba Hubbard in less than 50% of leagues on Yahoo. That might have changed since Tuesday, but Chuba Hubbard would be up there. I would see if there's anybody else that you can look at. I don't like either of these options for you, Jose. Forced to choose, it would be Zamir White, assuming Mixon and Dameon Pierce do play. Gabe says, thanks. Thank you, sir. I really appreciate it. Really appreciate you hopping in here. Having trouble connecting. I don't know. Hopefully you guys can hear me. But anyways, L. Smith says, yo, what's up, L. Smith? L. Smith wants to know T. Higgins, Devontae, or Garrett Wilson. I mean, that is a great problem to have. You're either in like a 4-team league or like a dynasty and you've balled out in dynasty. I don't know, man, but kudos to you for building this team. You can't really go wrong here. Now, it's been brought to my attention that Davante Adams popped up on the injury report, I believe, with a hamstring on Thursday. That's always scary. Hamstrings in general are terrifying in fantasy football because they're the type of injury that sometimes players risk it and try and go do it, go do the thing, and then 1 minute into the game, they pull a hamstring and they're pulled out of the game and you're stuck with a 0 in your lineup. So that's automatically scary. But let's do a quick version of the heat map to figure some of this out here. Now, Davante Adams, high-end wide receiver 2. He is getting 9+ targets per game. So he is going to have big weeks like he had in week 2, I believe it was. He's averaging 9 targets per game, but also just, quote unquote, just 15 PPR points per game. He scored 26 points on 12 targets in week 2, but he's been under 11 points in each of the 2 games since, but he's still, again, at worst, he got 6 targets. He had 9 targets in week 3, even though he didn't do too much with them. The Browns are middle of the pack against wide receivers. They're holding them to the 16th fewest catches, fewest yards, 14th most PPR points. The game itself, Browns Raiders, where are you? Is ugly. 37.5 point over under. That's among the lowest on the 16 game slate. The Raiders are projected to score fewer than 20 points. This game is just it's just one that theoretically I don't want much exposure to if I don't have to. Now, Davante Adams is obviously one of those exceptions to the rules. Typically, if you have Davante Adams, you put him in your lineup. Although you have a very, very interesting situation here. Now, Brandon Cook, CeeDee Lamb, Brian Thomas, Malik Neighbors, and Wan'Dale Robinson. All 5 of those guys scored at least 11 or more PPR points. Of course, we're looking for more than 11 from a guy like Davante Adams. Just one of them was able to get past 15 PPR points, and he did rip off 28 plus, but he was the only one to score 15 or more. Don't love that for Davante Adams' chances. Again, we talked about the implied total and how low it is. The Browns have been tough on wide receivers for years. The Browns have held enemy wide receivers to the 8th fewest or worst PPR points per game in each of the last 3 seasons, including the 3rd fewest last year. It's a tough-ish matchup. It's a gross game. He pulled his hamstring. I'm just not loving Davante as much in week 4 as I would in most weeks. Now, T. Higgins, that is game number 2. So we'll find T. Higgins right here in column B. We're feeling pretty good about T. Higgins. Again, nice implied point total, 26 points, which is the 2nd most among all teams. The Bengals are expected to score a lot of touchdowns. Strong over-under of 47.5. Now, T. Higgins wasn't limited in week 3. He played 90% of the offensive snaps. That signals full strength. That signals he's good to go. And if he's good to go in a Joe Burrow offense, he is going to smash at some point, even if he didn't in week 3. The Panthers are middle of the pack against wide receivers. And again, we talked about this a little bit earlier. Chris Olave and Davante Adams both came up short of 9 PPR points against the Panthers. And while that was happening, the other guys, the other wide receivers were going nuts against the Panthers. Rashid Shaheed, Quentin Johnson, Jacoby Myers, and Trey Tucker all tagged them for 16 or more PPR points. Quentin Johnson and Trey Tucker scored 22 or more. So that suggests to us that the Panthers could do everything they can to shut down Jamar Chase, which would free up opportunity for T. Higgins. That's a good thing for T. Higgins. Maybe not a great thing for Jamar Chase, but it's a good thing for Higgins. Now, again, he didn't do much in his 2024 debut. He caught 3 of 6 targets for 39 scoreless yards and a very nice 6.9 PPR points. But just a reminder, T. Higgins is averaging 15 PPR points and 8 targets per game in 28 career games where he played at least 40% of the offensive snaps, or 40 offensive snaps with Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase. Meaning, yeah, last week was a clunker. It was his first game of the season. T. Higgins is going to get his. We've seen him erupt in games with Jamar Chase and with Joe Burrow. Don't love that last year's Panthers held opposing wide receivers of the 2nd fewest PPR points per game, but this year they're about middle of the pack. I'm feeling pretty good about T. Higgins. Last but not least, Garrett Wilson. Now, his 8.7 Aaron Rodgers targets per game is bound to explode at some point. And I mentioned this already. I like Garrett Wilson as a buy low option. I recommend once this show is over, put out a couple trade offers for Garrett Wilson because he hasn't erupted the way people expected him to when they drafted him at the end of the first round in 2024 fantasy leagues. But he is getting nearly 9 targets per game from Aaron Rodgers. And at some point, he's going to blow the roof off. It's going to happen. Now, this could be another game I mentioned here. It could be another slow game before he takes off for a couple different reasons. Now, the Jets' implied point total it's not bad, but it's not anything great. 22.75 points. It's the 12th most among all 32 teams. The Jets are 7-point home favorites in week 4. And the Broncos are sporting an implied point total of just 15.75 points, which is the second fewest on the week 4 slate. That suggests that the Jets should be able to win this game pretty easily, possibly scoring a majority of their points or a chunk of their points with defense. Like literally their defense scoring points. 7-point home favorites. That means that the Jets have a very positive game script, one that they should be looking to kill the clock in the second half of the football game, not asking Aaron Rodgers, not asking their passing attack to do too much. So theoretically, Garrett Wilson might not even be needed for all 60 minutes here. Last year's Broncos held wide receivers to the 13th fewest PPR points per game. And oh yeah, by the way, Garrett Wilson's going to be dancing with Pat Surtain. He's a, 96, I think it was, $96 million corner for good reason. Pat Surtain is legit. He's a stud, and Garrett Wilson's going to be dancing with him all afternoon. The Broncos are currently the best team in all of fantasy football when it comes to shutting down wide receivers, holding them to the 3rd fewest catches, 2nd fewest yards, 8th fewest touchdowns, and the fewest PPR points per game. DK Metcalf, Jackson Smith and Jigba, George Pickens, and Mike Evans all came up short of 6 PPR points against the Broncos. Now, again, Garrett Wilson is going to explode at some point, and he's got the talent to beat Pat Surtain, but there's just a lot working against Garrett Wilson here. There's a lot working against Devontae Adams here. I'd be going with T. Higgins. Hope that helps. Again, anybody listening, put out some trade offers for Garrett Wilson. If you're liking the week 4 heat map, I dropped some links in the comments. There's also links in the descriptions. You can scoop up the week 4 heat map for $4.99. I'm just asking that you buy a guy a beer. That's all I'm asking. Other than that, you can get the whole season. I think the cost is down to, I take $3 off every week of the season-long package. So it started up at $59.99 and we're down to $50.99. $50.99, and you would get the rest of the season for $50.99. All right, here we go. Joseph Machida wants to know Brock Bowers or Kyle Pitts this week. Brock Bowers is a rare tight end that is getting a lot of volume in 2024. Like, as bad as tight ends have been in recent years, they're like 2024 is wild. Travis Kelce, Sam Laporta, basically every tight end in the first 5 rounds. Travis Kelce, Sam Laporta, Mark Andrews, Dalton Kincaid. Trey McBride's done all right, but anyway, since he's right in front of my face, let's start with Kyle Pitts. Every single week I like Kyle Pitts, and every single week he breaks my heart. And this has been going on for years now. Could this finally be the week tight end 1 with a delicious matchup in week 4? We're talking Kyle Pitts here. After 3 games, the New Orleans Saints are getting spanked by tight ends. They're allowing the 6th most catches, 3rd most yards, 4th most PPR points, and they're doing all of that despite not allowing a single touchdown to tight ends yet. They haven't allowed a single score from a tight end. So imagine how much worse they'll be when they do start allowing tight end or touchdowns. And anybody who understands basic math can see the touchdown regression coming. When they're giving up so many catches and so many yards, eventually the touchdowns are going to follow. The Saints are reeling. Luke Schoonmaker, who's a backup tight end. He filled in for Jake Ferguson. He up and scored over 10 PPR points against the Saints in week 2. And then, by the way, Dallas Goedert went absolutely nuts last week. He stole their lunch money with 27 PPR points in week 3. So the Saints are fresh off of getting absolutely ripped apart by Dallas Goedert. It's not necessarily a new trend. Last year's Saints allowed the 13th most PPR points per game. Now, there's not anything that's especially sexy about the game itself, right? The over-unders 42.5, not bad, not great. The Falcons' implied point total is 22 points. Not bad, not great. It just kind of meh. It is what it is. But again, Kyle Pitts just isn't getting the work again. He's averaging 4 targets, not 3 catches, 35 yards. He's averaging 8.2 PPR points per game. He did well in week 1 because he found the end zone. He scored 11.6 PPR points, but fewer than 8 PPR. Fewer than 8 points in the 2 games since then. If you're betting on Kyle Pitts this week, you're betting on the matchup. And it's a good, there's no denying it's a good one. This is a potential blow up spot for Kyle Pitts. They just have to throw him the football. I don't understand what's so hard about that, Falcons coaches. Throw the guy the football. But then again, we're talking Brock Bowers, right? Game number 12, slide down here a little bit. This is kind of the opposite. This is the opposite of Kyle Pitts. Brock Bowers is getting the work. He's getting the targets. He's averaging 7 targets, 6 catches, 65 plus yards per game, and 12.6 PPR points per game. That in and of itself would make it really hard for me to bench Brock Bowers. Any tight end that's getting 7 targets per game should basically be locked into a fantasy football lineup because you just don't have those guys so far in 2024. Now, he's coming off his worst game of the season, just 4 targets last week, but he otherwise had 8 plus targets and 11 plus PPR points in both weeks 1 and 2. And again, this is the opposite of Kyle Pitts. Kyle Pitts had a great matchup, but no volume. Brock Bowers has great volume, but the matchup isn't terrific. The Browns are holding tight ends to the 12th fewest catches, 13th fewest yards, and 16th most points, not yards. See, when you write 250 players a week, eventually you screw up a word or two. Now, that being said, while the numbers don't look great when you're going against the Browns, to be fair, the only fantasy relevant tight end that the Browns have played against is Jake Ferguson, whose week 1 was cut short by an injury. So they didn't even play him against a full game. Other than that, they played against the Jaguars when they didn't have Evan Ingram, and then the Giants, who don't have a tight end, period. Now, what we don't love is the game itself. The over-under's tiny, 37.5. There's not going to be a lot of touchdowns here. The Raiders themselves, they're expected to score fewer than 20 points. So if we're betting on Brock Bowers, we're betting on catches and receiving yards. So hopefully this is a PPR league. Again, it's the sort of thing where Brock Bowers is entering can't bench territory. Kyle Pitts is a great, I need to find an option. I'm going to throw him into my lineup sort of thing. Not saying you could add him off waivers, but it's if you got him, start him. But Brock Bowers is a tight end where he's getting volume that most tight ends don't get. The thing that I usually like to do in this situation, Joseph, is look at my matchup. So, for example, if you're going against CeeDee Lamb or Malik Neighbors, who scored about 20 points last night, now okay, maybe I need a little bit of upside. So I'm going to, if I need the upside play, that could be Kyle Pitts. The matchup is ripe for Kyle Pitts to go absolutely nuts if they just throw him the ball. Whereas Brock Bowers, you're going to be betting on catches and yards, probably not touchdowns. Now, on the flip side, if you played against, let's say, Devin Singletary, who did nothing last night, and now you're, okay, my opponent's off to a not great start. I have a chance to win this game if I just play it safe, so to speak. Then you take the 7, 8 plus targets per week. And if you don't have that option, if you don't have that, if there's not one way or the other where you're I need upside or I need safety, I would just go with the Brock Bowers, because typically, A, it's hard to find a guy getting that kind of volume, and B, typically that kind of volume automatically creates fantasy points. So the Raiders might not be expected to score a lot, but if they do, Brock Bowers is a decent bet to be one of the guys that scores. In fact, I have let's see if I can pop it up real quick. On the back end, this is going to look nasty to you, but don't worry, because this isn't something that my subscribers are using. This is something that I use on the back end when I'm regression cheat sheet or a touchdown regression tab. And Brock Bowers is pretty high up that list. He has 197 yards, but he has no touchdowns. And when you look at league averages, when you're looking at yards, Brock Bowers is due for, or he should have about 1.7 more touchdowns than he does, given the yards and the targets and the receptions that he currently has. So if the Raiders score a touchdown, Brock Bowers has a good chance to be that guy. If you're aiming for maximum upside, go Kyle Pitts. If you're aiming for anything else, Brock Bowers. Addy Gerard, what's up, bro? What's up, bro? How do you feel about starting Chuba Hubbard over Ramondre, Jerome Ford, or Tony Pollard? Look, like I said, I mentioned earlier that if I have an opportunity to take Ramondre out of my lineup, I'm looking for that opportunity. Now, that said, for the same reason I don't like Ramondre Stevenson, 10.5 point favorites, I also don't love Chuba Hubbard this week because they're 4.5 point underdog. Patriots are 10.5 point underdogs, not favorites. The Panthers are 4.5 point underdogs. So theoretically, they'll be pressed into a pass heavy game script. Now, if I'm not mistaken, Chuba Hubbard does have 5 targets in each of the last 2 games. If I'm not mistaken, the Bengals are 0-3. They just can't, they lost to the Patriots. They lost to the Commanders. Who knows if they're even going to show up against Andy Dalton and the Panthers. So I hate Chuba less than I hate Ramondre Stevenson in fantasy football. I'm sure that the humans are completely fine. I don't hate the humans. Jerome Ford, I do not love Jerome Ford just in general. I noted once, where is it here? It's a great matchup. So I do love that for Jerome Ford. The Raiders are getting smacked around by running backs. They've always been bad against running backs. For the last 4 years, the Raiders have allowed the 9th most or more PPR points per game to opposing running backs in each of the last 4 seasons. Now, what I don't like and what has me concerned about Jerome Ford is that right here. In the 2 games that the Browns have lost, Jerome Ford paced the backfield in touches. He had 18 and 13 touches in the 2 games that the Browns have lost. But in the 1 game that the Browns have won, it was Deontay Foreman who had 15 touches compared to just 8 touches for Jerome Ford. Now, the Browns are technically underdogs here, so theoretically that works in Jerome Ford's favor, but the spread is just 1.5 points. And are we really expecting Gardner Minshew, who's struggled with I love Gardner Minshew, but he struggled with the Raiders. Are we expecting him to light up a Browns defense that's been pretty studly over the last couple years? I think the Browns have a really good chance of winning this game. And if they do, they're going to want to feed the running game as much as they possibly can, something they couldn't do last week when they fell behind the New York Giants. So they're going to want to feed the running game, and who's going to get those carries? It very well could be Deontay Foreman. Jerome Ford is a riskier play in week 4, than a lot of people realize. And now we get to the last one, Tony Pollard, which is the answer. By the way, Tony Pollard is my answer to this question. And let's dig into why real quick. Now, the Titans-Dolphins game, like I mentioned earlier, I don't want a big part of this. There's very few players from this game that I'd be interested in for fantasy football, but Tony Pollard is one of them. And here's why. Quality RB2 play, matchup-based upside in week 4. He had 2 really, really good games. He's averaging 16.7 touches. So he's getting 16 plus touches per game, 13 plus PPR points per game. He scored 15 plus PPR points on 19 or more touches in each of the first 2 games. Now, last week was different. He only had 9 touches in week 3, but the Titans fell behind the Packers pretty early, and they were forced to put the football in the air, something that likely won't happen against Skylar Thompson or Tyler Huntley or whoever the Dolphins have to trot out at quarterback this week. The Titans should be competitive. Tony Pollard should stay plenty involved. That's why something like the spread, which is narrow, comes into play where it's only 1.5. That suggests a neutral game script that's going to allow Tony Pollard to stay involved for all 60 minutes, unlike last week. Now, the Dolphins so far, they're getting absolutely rocked by running backs. They're allowing the 8th most rushing yards, 2nd most touchdowns, 5th most PPR points per game. And that's even despite holding running backs to the 12th fewest touches and 2nd fewest catches. So they might not be allowing a ton of volume, but when they are, they're getting smashed by running backs. James Cook and Zach Charbonnet both scored more than 25 PPR points against the Dolphins in the last 2 games. Travis Etienne got him for nearly 14 points in week 1 on just 14 touches. There's a lot to like about Tony Pollard. There's not a lot to like about this game, but there's a lot to like about Tony Pollard's chances of volume, whereas Chuba Hubbard, Ramondre Stevenson, and Jerome Ford all have something working against them in terms of potential volume. I'd be going with Tony Pollard here, and I would feel really good about that decision. It's not particularly close. All right, guys, let's try and go rapid fire here. My back is killing me. I don't know where that's coming from, but let's go rapid fire, and then let's wrap this thing up. Christian Kirk or T. Higgins this week? I love T. Higgins. We already talked a little bit about him. I need to remind myself where we're at with the Jaguars. Jaguars, Texans. Jaguars are going to be chasing points. They're 6.5 point underdog. Here, I'll highlight it. The Jaguars are 6.5 point underdogs against the Texans. That is typically a good thing for pass catchers on an underdog because it suggests, okay, if the Jaguars are 6.5 point underdogs, they're going to be losing to the Texans. They're going to be a negative game script. Eventually, they might have to abandon the run, put the ball in the air. Eventually, they're going to have to play aggressive to try and catch up to the Texans. That might not be a great thing for Trevor Lawrence because it increases his chances of interceptions, but interceptions don't hurt wide receivers. It's a good thing for wide receivers. It increases Christian Kirk's chances of raising his target volume from what we saw in the last couple weeks. Last week, he woke up a little bit. So anyway, good chance for Christian Kirk to see some pretty significant volume in this game as the Jaguars are trying to catch up to the Texans. And if the Jaguars show up and if they can compete, unlike last week, then this game does have shootout potential. But the Jaguars have been bad for 3 weeks. It's a tough offense to trust right now. Meanwhile, you got the Cincinnati Bengals. You got a strong over-under, some sneaky shootout potential, man. Andy Dalton got those boys going last week. It's possible that the Bengals have been real bad. Like, we saw what happened. The Commanders scored, 38 on them last week? They've been real bad. It's possible Andy Dalton against his old team comes back and he gets the boys fired up, and this game has sneaky shootout potential. It's a good matchup for T. Higgins, especially. We talked a little bit about the Panthers shutting down opposing wide receiver ones while the wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3s on other teams beat the Panthers. That would be T. Higgins. If it's me, I'd feel more confident and comfortable with T. Higgins. After what we saw from Christian Kirk, there's some I want to see more of week 3 Christian Kirk before I can fully buy into it. Now, keep in mind, Christian Kirk over the last 2 years with the Jaguars has been terrific. Week 3 Christian Kirk is more in line with what we should expect from Christian Kirk moving forward. Weeks 1 and 2 were hopefully just an anomaly. That word trips me up every single time. But I'd be going with T. Higgins. If it's a PPR league, there's definitely a case to be made for Christian Kirk, but I would be going with T. Higgins there. All right. Chaka wants to know, would you trade Devontae Smith and Zach Moss for A.J. Brown? All right, so in a vacuum, the trade is fine. It might be a little too much to give up for A.J. Brown because the gap between A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith isn't as large as people think it is. There's a gap. A.J. Brown is definitely the better option, but it's not as big as people think it is. And Zach Moss is getting a lot more volume than anybody expected coming into the season. So it's probably too much for A.J. Brown, but it's fine. Now, whether or not you should do this depends on the rest of your roster. What running backs you have, what wide receivers you have, what needs you have, etc. Or, it's possible that A.J. Brown plays this week and Devontae Smith doesn't. So if you need a wide receiver this week, like that, those sorts of things matter. Although A.J. Brown might not play either. All of those things matter, but I'll say that in a vacuum, just looking at this, I personally would probably, I always want to be on the one side of a 2-for-1. I want to get the best player in a trade. In that case, or in this case, it's Zach Moss is the best player in this trade. It's A.J. Brown. The other thing that can't be overstated, that's super important here, is your league makeup. Okay. Is this an 8-team league, a 10-team league, a 12-team league? How many bench spots are there? So for example, if you're in, say, a 10-team league and there's 15 total roster spots, that means the waiver pool is going to be plentiful. And you're going to be able to find running backs as the season goes on and injuries occur that could theoretically just replace Zach Moss. I mean, Chase Brown is still a good roster stash in the event that he's able to take over for Zach Moss if he ever gets an opportunity. So if you're in a deep league where there's not a lot of action on waivers, there's not a lot to find on waivers, and you can use that depth, the Devontae Smith and Zach Moss side of this is appealing. If you're in a shallow league and there's plenty of action on waivers and you have an opportunity to just maximize your starting lineup, give me the AJ Brown side of this. The last thing I'll say on this is, knowing what you know about your own roster, will both Devontae Smith and Zach Moss be in your starting lineup the majority of weeks? And if so, that might be too pricey. That might be too much of a price to pay if you don't have a next man up at running back. Hopefully that helps. If not, shoot me another message and we'll keep working through it. Otherwise, like I said, I suggest sliding into my fantasy football Discord server and dropping that into the trades column. There's 197 other fantasy football players in here, most of which are super sharp fantasy football players, by the way, like guys who have won thousands and thousands of dollars on DFS. Very good advice, very good analysis inside that fantasy football Discord server. Victor, great job so far. Thanks to the heat map and the Discord channel. Positive numbers on all 3 leagues. Thanks, Mikey, and the support experts. Victor, man, I appreciate you so much. I got to tell you guys, this feedback gets me so fired up. It keeps me going. I'll be the first to tell you guys that owning and operating a business was never my plan. It's the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. And keep in mind, I'm raising 2 children under 8. Okay. That's not easy, but running a business is the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I struggle with self-doubt all the time. And I got to tell you, when I get feedback like this, it genuinely keeps me going. It's fuel for the fire, and it keeps this whole thing burning and moving forward. So I appreciate that, Victor. Thank you so much. Jordan, based on Atlanta's offense so far, not 100% convinced Arthur Smith ever left. It's funny, man, because I watched the tape and I watched the games, and there's flashes. You can see that the Falcons offense is there, and they're going to put it together as time goes on. We see this a lot when quarterbacks switch teams, that offenses take a minute to get going. Like year 2 of Kirk Cousins should be 3 times better than year 1 of Kirk Cousins with the Falcons. But still, man, it's so frustrating knowing what Kirk Cousins has done for Justin Jefferson and TJ Hawkinson and Jordan Reed and Pierre Garçon and all these guys in his history, and just see Drake London's not quite popping. Kyle Pitts is not quite popping. Get those guys the football. Oh, it's driving me nuts. Oh, my beautiful bride. My beautiful bride popped in to say hi, love. Hello, babe. You just made my day. I got goosebumps sliding in here. So shout out to my wife. She's a teacher, middle school teacher here in Wisconsin, which I always think my job's hard. She's got the hardest, most underappreciated job on the planet. Please, if you have kids in school, thank the teachers. That's all I have to say. Okay. And by the way, you know what? Never mind. I won't go there because I don't want to get her in trouble. But thank you for popping in on your prep. I think you're on prep right now, so thanks for sliding in here. Love you. See you soon. Looking forward to date night. Thank you, bro. Thanks for popping in here. Really appreciate it. Joey, would you trade Jonathan Taylor and something for Jamar Chase? It definitely depends on the something. I would love to have Jamar Chase, but Jonathan Taylor's balling, man. And as long as he stays healthy, he's going to keep balling. So I wouldn't add too much to Jonathan Taylor to get to Jamar Chase. Breaking news from Michael Penny. NFL considers postponing Cincinnati at Carolina due to widespread flooding. Ooh, that's no good. That's super helpful to know, Michael. Thank you so much. Typically what happens is I finish the heat map on Thursday, and then I kind of unplug for the next 24 hours because, believe me, I need my batteries to recharge. When you write 16 games, 32 teams, 250 players, and you guys see the details that go into this. I'm doing this for every single player in every single game, every single week. So usually by the time I put this thing out on Thursday, I need to recharge the batteries, and I kind of unplug from the NFL. So this is news to me. Definitely didn't know about this. And I need to go through and update the heat map. But this is super, super, super helpful to know. Really glad you put this out there. Just so anybody's interested, usually when we get stuff like this, I slide into the in the fantasy football Discord server. I have a channel called Mikey Drops or Mike Drops, whatever you want to call it, where I usually put out alerts because then my subscribers get it right on their phone. And it'll tell them, hey, just a heads up, this and this might be happening. Get this player out of your lineup, get this player in your lineup. Or most often it's hey, really quickly before your league mates do, get to the waiver wire, add this player sort of thing. So Michael, I really appreciate that, man. That is super helpful, and that will definitely be communicated to all of my subscribers. Thanks, man. All right. KJ Frederick, Hurts or Dalton revenge game, full PPR, concerned with all the missing wide receiver for the Eagles. I appreciate the question, KJ, and I'm rooting big time for the red rifle, Mr. Andy Dalton, but there's no world in which I am benching Jalen Hurts to get the Andy Dalton. Could totally be wrong about that, but if I have Jalen Hurts, I'm not going to put him on the bench. One thing I will mention about all the missing wide receivers for the Eagles is we could see Jalen Hurts do what we all fell in love with him to begin with, and that's run the football. Like, it's not good to be without A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith, but it also increases the probability that Jalen Hurts doesn't like what he sees when he drops back into coverage and he looks around and he doesn't like what he sees, he takes off. Okay. So I believe I mentioned that in here. Yeah, here we go. Jalen Hurts could be without both AJ Brown and Devontae Smith in week 4, but could that theoretically lead to more scrambles and more, hold on, let me pop that up here. Could that theoretically lead to more scrambles and more rushing yards for Jalen Hurts? So yes, there's a give-get sort of situation there. But other than that, man, you got the Eagles in a possible shootout with the Buccaneers, who have struggled against quarterbacks. They've struggled against wide receivers historically. That game could definitely shoot out. Eagles, Buccaneers are two really good offenses. There's no chance that I'm benching Jalen Hurts. Michael Penny, note, Eagles, A.J. Brown ran routes this morning and Devontae Smith did not practice. Yeah, so Dr. Deepak Chona is not expecting... Dr. Deepak Chona is not expecting Devontae Smith to play. And by the way, I'm not saying his word is gospel, but I do look at Dr. Deepak Chona's notes every single day, and that impacts how I create the heat map. Now, of course, anybody's highlighted in red means I have injury updates. I need to come back and update once I have more data. But Dr. Deepak Chona is not expecting Devontae Smith to play because of the concussion. Early on, he was expecting A.J. Brown to play because, again, I mentioned he has this massive database of player injuries, effectiveness, and history suggests that A.J. Brown's injury should be good to go. He should be good to return in week 4. The wrench in that plan is that the Eagles have a bye week in week 5. And a lot of teams, when they have a player that's nicked up, they like to sit them out that game before the bye week because now you're guaranteed another 2 weeks of rest. And when it comes to something like a hamstring, another 2 weeks of rest is not a bad thing for A.J. Brown. So there's a part of me that's hoping that they just play it safe, keep him out of the game. But there's another part of me that has a lot of A.J. Brown. It's like, no, I kind of need him to get in there. So the fact that he ran routes this morning is a good sign that he's ready to go. But keep in mind, the Eagles might still play it safe and keep him out. Just keep an eye on that news as we go. Michael, thanks again. Michael's going to be my breaking news guy popping in here. I appreciate that, sir. All right, last one. Then we're going to slide out of here. Isaiah Likely or Noah Fant full PPR? Isaiah Likely. Don't get me wrong. I really liked what I saw from Noah Fant last week. He had 6 targets. There's just so many mouths to feed in that offense with DK Metcalf, who I love this week, Jackson Smith and Jigba, who I love this week. Then you got Tyler Lockett, who is also in a great position to smash. Like, Seahawks wide receivers are in a terrific spot. Look at this. The Lions have a 2 next to their name underneath wide receiver. What that tells us is that the Lions are allowing the second most PPR points per game to opposing wide receivers. The Seahawks are going to be throwing the ball. They're 3.5-point underdogs. It's going to be a shootout, 46.5-point over under. Seahawks have a solid implied total. Great matchup. DK Metcalf should eat. That's why he's in the green category with a blue button. There's only 4 or 5 guys with a blue button this week. Blue button means watch out, this dude could go nuclear. Jackson Smith and Jigba should eat. Tyler Lockett should eat. And again, I did like what I saw from Noah Fant, but I need to see more of it in week 4. I liked the 6 targets that we saw from Noah Fant, and hopefully we see that keep going. But again, with DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, and Jackson Smith and Jigba in the lineup and in a great matchup, Noah Fant is going to be no better than 4th in line for targets, whereas Isaiah Likely, who's going to be in a matchup with the Buffalo Bills, another shootout. The Ravens have a stronger implied total, meaning a stronger possibility of touchdowns than the Seahawks, right? Ravens are expected to get about 25. Seahawks are expected to get about 21, 22. Theoretically, greater chance of touchdowns for the Ravens. Advantage Isaiah Likely. It's going to be a shootout. Bills should be able to keep this game close, and the Bills are offering the 8th most PPR points per game to opposing tight ends. So to me, I'm rolling the dice on Isaiah Likely, and that one, I would feel really confident in that decision there. So, all right. I think that'll do it. I think I'm ready for that beer. Again, guys, if you like what you see with the heat map, I cannot recommend trying it out enough. By the way, if you're not ready and you want to test it out, send me a message. You can email me, Mikey@basementbrewedff.com. Message me on Facebook, message me on LinkedIn, message me on Patreon, message me on Twitter, wherever. And I will send you the week 3 heat map, and you can click around. You can play with it all you want to get a feel for what it's all about. But if you like what you're seeing, you want to test this bad boy out, it costs less than 1 beer. It's $4.99 per month. Or not per month, excuse me. $4.99 for the week 4 heat map. If you want to get the whole season, every heat map from here on out, it's $50.99. And you can get all of that at my... I'm trying to copy and paste this one right here. Patreon.com/basementbrewedff. Okay. Now, if you go into the shop on Patreon, that's where you can find the heat maps. Other than that, you can also choose, I have monthly tier options where you can join our Discord server, which is what I mentioned before. It's an online community, online army, 200 other fantasy football players that are in here just helping each other dominate every single week. So just follow the link to that Patreon. I left it in the comments. It's also in the description and the show notes below, where you can go get the heat map. You can go get the whole season of heat maps. You can join our Discord server. I promise you, you will not regret it. And if you do, let me know and I will send your money back. All right. That's going to do it for today's conversation. If you have any other questions or anything else you want to know, again, feel free to send me an email, Mikey@basementbrewedff.com. Hit me up on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, wherever. I'm anywhere that you can find me. And by the way, if you're on the YouTube channel and you have not subscribed yet, we're trying to grow that YouTube channel as fast as we can. So please press that subscribe button. I am back every single Friday, noon Central. Grab your lunch, grab your first weekend beer, bring your fantasy football questions, and meet me back here at the same time next week, every Friday, noon Central, right here on the Basement Brewed Fantasy Football YouTube channel. I'll see you then. I'll see you on the fantasy football field. Good luck in week 4. Cheers. This brew's for you.